She was barely breathing, no bigger than a man's hand. Alone on the cracked earth, her pale fur soaked in blood and rain. Vultures circled, the sky darkened, and even the rangers looked away. They said she was too small to survive. Too weak. Too wild. But one woman refused to walk away. And what she did changed everything they thought they knew about nature. Before we start, just imagine being the only hope for a life no one believes in. If this story moves you, even a little, let that be the reason you hit subscribe. Not for us. For every forgotten creature waiting to be seen. The storm had been building for days. It began with distant thunder, too far to take seriously, a low grumble across the Luangwa plains. But by the third day, it had become relentless. Wind tore through the mahogany trees like some ancient, unseen predator. The red earth turned to sludge, and the winding trails used by bush scouts became impassable veins of mud. Animals that usually roamed freely retreated deeper into the trees. The land held its breath under the weight of the water pouring from the sky. In the midst of it all, a whisper reached the radio tower of the Luangwa Wildlife Rehabilitation Trust, a faint, static-choked message from a poacher-turned-scout named Simu. He'd seen something strange near the riverbed. Something pale. Shaking. Alone. The line crackled before it went silent again. 2 hours later, Dr. Maya Ellison was throwing on her rain-soaked field jacket and loading emergency supplies into the back of an open-bed cruiser. She wasn't supposed to be here yet. Her transfer from Lusaka had barely been processed, and she'd only arrived on a brief orientation visit. But the mention of a white cub was enough to override protocol. This was not just a case, it was a life, teetering on the edge. As they sped through the flooded bush, Maya gripped the door with one hand, the other steadying her bag of field equipment. Rain lashed the windshield like shards of glass. Her breath misted in the air. The temperature had dropped dramatically, unusual even for Zambia's unpredictable climate. 30 minutes in, they reached a steep embankment, where the river had risen over its banks. The cruiser skidded to a stop in the mud. Scout Simu emerged from a grove of mopane trees, his poncho clinging to his thin frame. He didn't speak, he just nodded and pointed to a hollow near the collapsed base of a tree, partly shielded by dripping vines. Maya rushed forward, boots sinking into the ground, heart thundering louder than the rain. And then she saw it. A lump no larger than a curled-up kitten. Covered in slick, pale fur, nearly white, though streaked with mud. It wasn't moving. Maya dropped to her knees, ignoring the water seeping into her pants. Gently, she lifted the cub. It fit entirely in her 2 hands, light, terrifyingly so. Its nose was pink, its eyes sealed shut with birth fluid and dirt. The body was still warm, but just barely. "White," Joseph muttered behind her, his voice low with disbelief. "Never seen one like that in my life." A leucistic cub. Not albino, its skin had pigment, and faint markings were visible under the wet fur. But a white panther? In Luangwa? It was the kind of thing whispered about by old trackers and dismissed by modern science as improbable. And it was dying. "No signs of trauma," Maya said aloud, checking for breaks or bruises. "But severe hypothermia. Malnourished. Less than a week old. Maybe 3 days." "Mother?" Joseph asked. Maya shook her head. No prints, no drag marks, no blood. No other cubs. The mother was either dead, or had rejected the runt. "He won't make it," Joseph said again, softer this time. "Then we better hurry," Maya replied, rising with the cub pressed against her chest. She wrapped it in the emergency thermal blanket, careful not to jostle his tiny limbs. Every few seconds she watched his ribs rise, fall, barely. She named him Sol. Not after the sun in the sky, that would have been too easy. But after Sol, the Spanish word for soul. For something luminous and defiant. By morning, the rain began to ease. Sunlight filtered through the clouds in ghostly beams, illuminating the camp like a cathedral. Maya stepped outside, exhausted and exhilarated. She took a breath, deep, slow, grounding, and turned as Joseph emerged from the mess tent. "You're still going?" he asked, surprised. "I have to," she said simply. "He's fighting." Joseph rubbed his chin. "They won't let him stay. Not if he's this weak." Maya didn't answer. She already knew the rules. Wild cubs with low survival odds were to be euthanized or transferred to permanent captivity. Sol had neither the weight nor the strength to meet the benchmarks. And the fact that he was white, a rare, recessive mutation, would only complicate things. Conservation authorities would label him an outlier. A burden. An unnatural fluke. But Maya had looked into the eyes of that cub, and she saw nothing unnatural. Just a soul trying to survive. That night she wrote a full medical report, including body temperature trends, feeding data, reflex response, and projected health indicators. She attached a request, extension of emergency care for unnamed cub #22B, Sol, and sent it to the Wildlife Council via satellite uplink. Then, she returned to the incubator, placed her hand beside Sol's tiny body, and whispered, "I'm here. I'm not giving up. So don't you dare either." By the end of day 2, Sol's eyes began to open, slowly, painfully, like petals of a stubborn flower. Pale green irises glistened in the low light. He looked up at her, unseeing at first. Then he blinked. Once. Connection. It wasn't science. It wasn't protocol. It was something deeper. And for Dr. Maya Ellison, it was the beginning of a decision that would change everything. They raced back through the swampy trail, the cruiser fighting the sludge. Maya held the cub the entire time, using her own body heat to keep him from slipping deeper into hypothermia. By the time they returned to the clinic tent, her shirt was soaked, and her hands had gone numb, but the cub's chest was still moving. She laid him inside the portable incubator, a modified one used for rescued antelope calves, and began to work. For fluids, diluted glucose. Warming pads around his sides. She massaged his tiny paws, her fingers trembling not from the cold, but from the weight of the moment. This wasn't a textbook case. This was uncharted territory. Every 5 minutes she administered drops of rehydration solution. Every 20, she used a dropper to feed him a synthetic formula made for premature carnivores. She did not sleep. Around 3 a.m., the cub gave the faintest flick of his ear. At 4:15, his front paw jerked. By sunrise, his jaw opened in a silent cry, no sound, just motion. But to Maya, it was the sound of hope. By the end of the first week, Sol could lift his head. Not much, just enough to glance around the dim clinic tent with hazy, newborn eyes. But to Maya, it was a revolution. His tiny spine, once limp and arched with helplessness, now held tension. His paws flexed. His jaw worked as he tried to nurse from the bottle without the dropper. It was clumsy and weak, but it was driven by something sacred, will. She recorded everything. Hourly weight increases. Response to sound. Body temperature fluctuations. Sol was still underweight by every standard. Still fragile. Still unable to thermoregulate on his own. But every morning brought a new flicker of strength. And every night, as the wind swept across the plains and the hyenas called from somewhere deep in the forest, Maya slept beside the incubator on a camp mat, one hand always resting near the edge. She had become his second heartbeat, the pulse he borrowed until he could create his own. But outside the soft hum of the clinic walls, the whispering had begun. The Wildlife Council had received her report. And they weren't pleased. Some called it premature. Others, irresponsible. Too much emotion. Not enough science. And yet none of them had seen the way Sol's chest rose when she called his name. None had felt his pulse, slow and fading, and chosen not to give up. 3 days after Sol first blinked at her, a government vehicle arrived at the Trust's front gate. Dust-covered, bearing the seal of the Wildlife Conservation Council. Maya stood on the porch of the clinic tent, arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching as 2 figures stepped out. One man wore a pressed khaki shirt and carried a clipboard. The woman beside him wore military-style boots and an expression made of iron. They didn't ask for tea. They didn't ask for context. They asked for the cub. The inspection had begun. Maya led them inside, her breath lodged somewhere between fury and fear. Sol was curled inside a nesting blanket, his pale fur fluffed around him like mist, as if he were made of fog and breath rather than blood and bone. He looked more like a snow fox than a panther, small, impossibly delicate. The woman crouched beside the crate and observed him with clinical detachment, the way one might study a strange fungus in a lab, not a life fighting for a future. He's a leucistic, Maya explained, voice steady but her hands trembling behind her back. Not albino, he has pigment, as you can see, and faint rosettes under the fur. This is a genetic rarity. His development was delayed, but he's responding. I've documented weight gain, muscle reflexes, auditory response. He tracks scent already. This isn't just a rescue, it's a biological anomaly. A once-in-a-decade event. The man with the clipboard didn't glance at the notes. Instead, he asked flatly, "And what's your plan? To bottle feed a predator into adulthood?" Maya felt her spine stiffen like steel. Rewilding. We've done it before, with caracals, servals, even leopards. It takes time, but it can be done. Not at this age, the man muttered. And not one like this. Then let him be the first. Maya snapped, no longer hiding the fire in her voice. The man finally looked up. We don't have the funding for experimental projects. Especially not ones that defy guidelines. He glanced at the woman, who stood and dusted off her hands. You're not in Lusaka anymore, Dr. Ellison, she said coldly. We don't make decisions based on sentiment here. We make them based on survival statistics. And this cub's odds are, he's alive. Maya interrupted, sharp and unforgiving. That should be enough. But it wasn't. The decision had already been made. They gave her 72 hours. If the cub didn't meet developmental benchmarks, standing unaided, lapping milk, demonstrating predator instincts, he would be deemed unfit for release. Maya didn't waste time with appeals. She knew how these things worked, knew the slow erosion of hope that came with every form letter, every delayed response. So that same night, beneath a bruised violet sky where stars peeked through bruised clouds, she acted. She packed Sol's crate with towels, extra formula, her old 4 kit, and the carved wooden warming pad Mama Jolly had once given her. She moved quietly, each step deliberate, avoiding the guards and the wandering eyes of the night staff. Past the ranger dorms, past the storage shed, and through the overgrown path that led to the valley's edge. It was not courage. It was necessity. She knew she couldn't explain it to them. Couldn't make them see what she saw, not a statistical anomaly, not a liability, but a life too rare to repeat. Only one person saw her go. Joseph stood silently in the doorway of his hut, arms folded. His face was unreadable. But as Maya passed, his voice carried in the dark like a leaf brushing across stone. You're not the first to do something stupid for something small. She turned, half expecting him to raise the alarm. Is that your way of saying you'll report me? It's my way of saying, I hope you don't fail. She disappeared into the trees. The hut was nothing more than a forgotten curing shed, its frame rotted, hinges rusted, termites slowly chewing at its bones. But it was dry. It was hidden. And more than anything, it was hers. Her sanctuary. Mama Jolly was already there, holding a lantern and a pair of thick blankets. I thought you might come, she said simply, no judgment in her voice. Maya laid Sol's crate in the corner. This wasn't a plan. It was a promise. And it had already begun. The first sign wasn't fire. It was the smell. Acrid. Sharp. Carried on the wind like a warning whispered too late. Maya had just finished feeding Sol. He was now strong enough to nurse directly from a shallow ceramic dish. She wiped the formula from his chin as he let out a small, satisfied growl. Then she stood, sniffed the air, and froze. Smoke. She stepped outside the hut, shielding her eyes from the afternoon sun. The horizon to the west, usually flat and golden, was smeared in gray. thick, fast-moving, rising in tall spirals over the trees. Her stomach dropped. Every dry season, controlled burns were carried out by local farmers to clear brush and renew soil. But they were risky, especially this year. The rains had come late. The land was brittle, grass like tinder. And this fire wasn't staying put. It was spreading. Fast. She turned back toward the hut. Sol was pawing lazily at a feather she'd tied to a stick, oblivious to the danger curling toward them. Panic hit her like a wave. She had no time to contact the trust, no time to plead for help. The hut was too far from the main road. No cell reception. No satellite signal. And if the fire jumped the ravine, they'd have 20 minutes, maybe less, before the whole slope went up in flame. She grabbed Sol's travel sling, wrapped him gently inside a cotton blanket, and slipped the small cub against her chest. His pale head peeked just above the edge, his wide eyes blinking at her heartbeat. "It's okay," she whispered, though she didn't believe it. "We're going to run now." She packed only what she could carry: formula canisters, his syringe set, the leather pouch of handwritten notes, and the wooden sun carving Mama Jolly had given her. Then she threw a damp cloth over her head and stepped into the wind. The world was different now. Ash floated like dark snow, landing in her hair and clinging to Sol's fur. The wind carried the roar of fire long before the flames themselves appeared. The grass ahead swayed. Ash floated like dark snow, landing in her hair and clinging to Sol's fur. The wind carried the roar of fire long before the flames themselves appeared. The grass ahead swayed in rhythmic waves, and through the gaps in the trees, Maya could see streaks of orange flickering like monsters awakening. She ran. Branches slapped her face. Roots tore at her boots. The sling pressed heavily into her chest with each step, but she cradled it like something holy, whispering constantly to the cub inside. "You're okay, Sol. Just stay with me." She didn't know where she was running, only that the hill to the east was steeper, rockier. Fire wouldn't climb it as fast. She followed instinct, years of wildlife response training, and sheer blind will. At some point, her foot snagged a root, and she fell hard, scraping her shoulder against the rocks. She curled instantly, shielding Sol from the blow. He yelped, tiny, frightened. "No, no, no!" she gasped, checking him. Still warm. Still breathing. But her vision blurred. Smoke stung her eyes. The fire was close now, so close she could feel the heat pressing against her back like a giant's breath. And then she heard it. A low rumble. Not thunder. Not flame. An engine. Bursting through the trees came an old Ranger Jeep, headlights slicing through smoke, grill coated in dust. Behind the wheel was Joseph, his face set like stone. Two young Rangers clung to the back rail, one waving his arms. Maya collapsed to her knees as the vehicle skidded to a stop. She barely managed to lift her hand before Joseph jumped down and reached her. "You really do make everything difficult," he said, grabbing her arm. "She's got the cub," one of the Rangers yelled. "She's got the white cub." Joseph's eyes softened just a moment as he saw Sol curled in the sling. Then, without another word, he helped Maya into the front seat, the engine already revving again. The Jeep turned sharply and roared back down the slope, away from the fire line now climbing into the sky. The day Maya faced the Wildlife Council, the air was so still it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. She stood beneath the portico of the Luangwa Trust headquarters, her arms still bandaged from the fire. Sol was not with her. He was resting in the care facility under quiet observation, but she could still feel his weight against her chest, like a ghost pressing through memory. It had been 5 days since the fire. 5 days since Joseph and the others had carried her and the cub out of the smoke and into safety. 5 days of silence from the council. Now they wanted answers. The boardroom inside was dim and cool. Ceiling fans rotated slowly overhead, doing little to relieve the tension. A long table stretched across the room, with 6 figures seated at its far end, officials, conservation biologists, and a government representative from Lusaka. Maya entered alone. She wore her field clothes, patched and slightly scorched, boots still dusted with ash. No attempt at performative professionalism. Just truth. Dr. Ellison, the chairman began, folding his hands neatly. Do you understand why you're here today? Maya's throat tightened, but she kept her voice level. Because I saved a life. A murmur rippled down the table. One of the biologists leaned forward. You defied council orders. Removed a wild animal from registered care. Transported it to an unauthorized facility. Denied access to council representatives. Risked human safety during a bushfire evacuation. Maya nodded. Yes. I did all of that. So you admit you broke protocol. I admit I made a choice. Between bureaucracy and survival. And I stand by it. There was silence. The government representative tapped his pen. This isn't about heroism, Dr. Ellison. This is about structure. Chain of command. Resources. What if your plan had failed? What if you had died with that cub in the fire? Then at least I would have died trying, Maya replied. Her voice shook now, just slightly. Trying to do the job I came here to do. Protect the voiceless. She reached into her bag and placed a folder on the table. Inside were photographs, Soul's growth timeline, vital signs, behavioral data, genetic notes. Evidence. Progress. Hope. He's not tame. She continued. He stalks, hides, shows defensive aggression. He's not bonded to me the way a domesticated animal would be. He's behaving more and more like a true wildcat every day. Given the right environment and support, I believe he can be reintroduced. If not into the open wild, then into a protected rewilding reserve. But to throw him into a cage because he's inconvenient would not be conservation. That would be cowardice. The chairman looked down at the photos. A long moment passed. Then, without looking up, he asked quietly, What's his name? Soul, Maya said. Short for soul. And the son. Both. 3 days later, the council made their decision. They would not charge Maya. There would be no penalties. No revocation of her license. Instead, a new initiative was approved, the Soul Protocol, a pilot program for studying high-risk rescues of rare or genetically significant cubs born under extreme odds. Under this protocol, Soul would become the first subject. The project would be co-supervised by One Vet Trust and the Institute for Ethical Rewilding, based in Cape Town. Maya was offered lead medical oversight. And for the first time in Zambian history, a conservation rulebook was rewritten because of a single cub. Word spread quickly. Articles appeared in wildlife journals. Conservation blogs picked up the story. The white panther who survived fire became a headline across African environmental networks. Photos of Soul, his pale eyes wide, his fur shimmering like frost, circulated around the world. Not as a pet. Not as a miracle. But as a symbol of what could happen when rules bowed to compassion. The rewilding compound was built 2 hours northeast of the Trust compound, deep in a valley lined with Miambo woodland and natural rock formations. It was secluded, protected, and structured like a half-wild corridor. Not a cage, but not entirely free. Maya moved there with Soul. At first, she remained the only human he interacted with. But even that faded. She fed him from a distance, minimized eye contact, introduced environmental triggers, live prey scent trails, hidden dens, branches coated with the smell of other predators. He responded instinctively, cautiously. At first, he hesitated. Then one day, he dragged a rabbit carcass into the thicket and didn't return until morning. After that, he stopped coming to the feeding trays entirely. He was hunting on his own. One cool morning, nearly 10 months after the day she first found him near the riverbed, Maya walked to the observation bluff overlooking the valley enclosure. The sun was just rising, painting the trees in gold. Soul stood on a rock outcropping, surveying the landscape.